Okay, so hello and welcome to Organizing Your FOIAs and Pitching the Investigative Story. My name is Alejandra Cancino, and I am a senior investigative reporter at the Better Government Association. It is a nonprofit newsroom that uses the power of investigative reporting to expose wrongdoing and hold government officials accountable. With me today are Lakidra Chavez. She's a reporter at the Trace Chicago, a nonprofit newsroom that covers gun issues. Prior to the Trace, she reported for ProPublica, Illinois, and Chicago Public Media. And we also have the great and the only Corey Johnson. He is a reporter on the investigative unit at the Tampa Bay Times. He previously worked at the Center for Investigative Reporting, where he uncovered systemic weaknesses in earthquake protections at thousands of California public schools. That work was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. More recently, Corey's stories have been prompted the discovery of dangerous amount of lead in the water, in drinking water in a Florida school, and kickstarted the FBI's investigation of a local religious leader. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So here we are. We have, you have researched your story idea. You submitted a FOIA. You waited and waited, and now you finally, maybe, hopefully you have a response. But it is massive. It is thousands of pages. Maybe it is a data set that is massive. So let's jump right in. Let's take a deep breath. I'm freaking out, but not really, because Corey and Lakira are here with me. So Corey, help me. I am freaking out. I don't know what to do. Do I run to my editor? Do I maybe open the FOIA and start reading the documents? What do you think I should do?
One, you need to stop freaking out, because the fact that you got some papers back is a good thing, not a bad thing. But then two, you got to know yourself. So some people are planners, some people are plungers. If you're a plunger, you just want to plunge ahead and start looking at the documents, figuring out how you're going to organize them, if you're going to organize them into digital folders and then index them, or you're going to print them out and put them in paper folders. It kind of is up to your individual preference and desire and style. But what you want to do is you want to start trying to get control of that information. You want to organize it, and you want to start reading it. I mean, the great investigative reporter Seymour Hersh said, "You don't write before you read." And so, in order to truly manage that information, you're going to have to start looking at it. You're going to have to start looking at the reports. You're going to have to start looking at the data. And if you can't make heads or tails out of that data, then you want to then start having other conversations or thoughts on who could. Is it a source you need to make? Is it a manual you need to get? But whatever it is, you won't really know the next step until you actually look at it. And so you want to look at that information, then you want to start organizing it, and then you want to start chopping away at it bit by bit. And what you'll find is, as you do that, you'll grow more confidence. You'll start to see things that will amaze you, that will wow you, and then it'll spark deeper thoughts, deeper possibilities, right? So, but the key thing is, from a psychological, emotional standpoint, not to freak out, not to be overwhelmed. Remember, you asked for this information, and so here it is. And if you think it's too massive, then maybe you need to have a conversation with your editor about breaking it up. Maybe bringing in someone else who can look at the records, who can and divvy it up. And you take this pile, they take this pile, and then you make notes, you put it into a common Word document or Google Doc, and then you take it from there. But the best and most important advice I can tell you is to be encouraged, don't freak out, take it one step at a time, and the information will reveal what kind of steps you need to take to start organizing it.
I already feel better. Don't you feel better? So I learned by doing, and Lakidra, I'm curious because some of the advice that Corey just mentioned are things that I think you might have done with a project with ProPublica Illinois, where you worked before your current job. You worked in this massive months-long investigation on what a project that is called Quiet Rooms. Can you tell us a little bit about what the project is and how you kept organized and what you did with the records that you collected?
Yeah, so the Quiet Rooms was a partnership investigation with the Chicago Tribune in Upper Publica, Illinois, where I was a fellow in 2019. And the Quiet Rooms basically looked at the use of seclusion or basically solitary confinement in public schools across the state, and eventually the use of physical restraints on children as well. And these are often children with disabilities. And the investigation really tried to find out, are these practices being used in accordance with the law? And of course, we found that oftentimes they weren't. But at the very beginning, I think this was probably towards the end of 2018, we started to get records back from school districts. We had asked for their records for about a school year and a half. And the records we got, sometimes they were massive PDFs with like 1,000 pages in them. And other times it was, paper documents that we would eventually have to haul around downtown. And we had to figure out a way to, one, track all of the FOIAs that we would eventually file for this investigation, which I think ended up being in the hundreds, and also coordinate this database. And so we tried to keep organized in Google Drive. So we had a FOIA tracker that we kept in a spreadsheet, so we could keep track of all of the FOIAs that we had for the investigation, as well as who had filed the FOIA. So we could follow up with that specific reporter and also know when their records were coming in. And then when it came time to sifting through all of the records that we had received for the investigation, we built a database in a Google spreadsheet as well. So yeah, that's how we tried to keep track of everything. We also had a separate planning doc to walk through, what we needed to be able to report out the story and, find the threads for the investigation.
Wow. So with the document that was 1,000 pages long, right? Like I get that. And again, I mean, I'm a nervous reporter. So I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to read 1,000 pages. And then another one is coming with another 1,000 pages. Did you really go through every single one of those pages and flip through them and read through them?
Yeah, we went through every single page, and it's important for several reasons, right? You're going to get the information that you're probably looking for. In this case, the state required that the school district keep track of the times that students were placed in isolation or restrained for, and the reason why. So we needed these documents to read the narrative to find out what was happening. And within that narrative, we eventually realized that it was sometimes direct quotes of what staff members were saying to these children. Oftentimes they were in extreme distress, and what the children were saying back to the staff members as they were being, kept inside of these rooms or being restrained. But also it's important to read through every single document so you can find things like duplications, which are really common in both paper records and also in the data that you might request for an investigation. And to also track inconsistencies. So if you are requesting a form that is 10 pages long and you're only getting 5 pages, that's something you need to go back and ask the agency about.
I really like that tip. Yes, right. I mean, right. If you're going through pages and you only got 1 through, it's supposed to be 1 through 20 and you're missing 5 of them, then what happened?
Yeah.
Corey, and I actually want to share my screen. I think I can do this, and talked a little bit about an investigation that you did a couple years ago when you work at Reveal. I've read this investigation a couple of times, and every time I find something new, it's just shocking. And can you tell us a little bit about what it is?
This particular investigation was, I found that the California prisons were coercing and had sterilized illegally hundreds of women in the prison systems, in their female prison systems. And it was a very difficult story to uncover because very few people knew that it was happening. The prisons are closed shops, so it's very hard to pry information out. But what I did there was was able to find reimbursements that the prison had made to a bunch of doctors who, as part of their medical services, were getting reimbursed for performing these sterilization surgeries. And so I was able to get the doctors' names and the dates of when the procedures happened and which prisons where it happened. And from that began like an odyssey to try to find who some of the women were and what were some of the reasons why these surgeries were taking place. In the federal law, since like the 1970s, sterilizations have been banned. But what we found was that in California prisons, there was this weird loophole that allowed the procedures to go forth if the state of California were using their own money to pay for it. And so we then were able to find out from doing a lot of interviewing that there were some doctors kind of at the root of these procedures who were pushing these procedures on women. And one doctor in particular, his name was James Heinrich, was able to get an interview with him where, I confronted him about these procedures and the fact that they were banned and they were still against prison rules, even though they weren't technically illegal. And he said, well, the money we paid for these surgeries was cheaper than paying for welfare for all these, unwanted kids that these women would have. And so that quote and combined with the other data, other interviews, just really like hit hard in California and nationwide, and ultimately resulted in a bunch of hearings, a state audit, which confirmed our reporting, and then a referral for criminal investigations on a bunch of doctors, and ultimately the passage of a law that banned those procedures. So that's the story in a nutshell. There's a PSA. There's a documentary that's out now called Belly of the Beast that's actually been streaming on various platforms that Mary J. Blige created a song for, which is up for an Oscar too. And,
wow.
So it's just, a little, it's just amazing what can grow out of a single story or a single journalism effort.
So I'm curious about here the fact that you were able to quantify, not that this is just happening to one person and you got a tip, but in the story you were very specific. You found nearly 150 women. How were you able to do that? Quantifying something like this must have been a tremendous amount of work.
Well, that's the challenge when you go into a story and you hear that something's wrong. The first step is to try to substantiate that it's happening, then to try to substantiate why is it happening, and then to try to see if you can get scope. Like, how many is this happening? Is this just a one-off and one situation that went bad, or is this a systemic issue? And so a lot of thinking about what documents, what data can help me prove this goes into it all along. And so in interviews, I'm asking about procedures. I'm asking, when you do these things, where do you write it down? When you pay these doctors, who's over that? Who controls that? What does it look like? And so as you're doing the investigation, you're also trying to find the mechanisms that quantify it. And in my case, I was lucky because there was a women's group that had gotten some partial data ahead of me, and they allowed me to see it. And I saw it, and it helped me to craft the kind of FOIA that I needed to file in order to get to the rest of the information to quantify it. And so that's the process. And really that process goes on in every story. Of what Lakedra mentioned in Quiet Rooms, which was an excellent investigation, was what they did there. Those reporters there Lakidra and team were able to quantify how many kids were being put in these weird rooms, how many of them were getting abused or being treated well. And that's the kind of thing that you need to have in order to produce change. It's not going to be the same document or the same data all the time on every story, but you go into a story asking about that kind of material so that you can get it.
And, you know, one of the things about this is that if I'm hearing this from the first time, and I wonder I guess the question is, how did you pitch this to your editor? Because this is an extremely sensitive subject. As you mentioned, this was actually illegal, and there was a loophole here. An editor might hear you say this and think, no, I don't think so. That practice has been illegal for a long time. How did you convince your editors to let you get to the bottom of this one?
That is actually a great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because there's the real world and there's the ideal world. In the ideal world, I will just be able to go up to my editor and go, hey, I think women are getting sterilized in the prison. Can I run off and investigate that? But in the real world, if I made that pitch to an editor without a single document or proof in my hand, it would get shut down. It would fall into the bucket of, that's an interesting idea, but it's not a story. And editors oftentimes will reject ideas all day long, even great ideas. I've had so many wonderful ideas that later turned out to be fantastic stories that were rejected up front because I pitched them too early. And so what I did on this project, I didn't pitch it to my editor until I had some data in hand. And once I had data showing that indeed the sterilizations were taking place, that's a different conversation. And that's a different conversation for an editor to hear. And so when I said to my editor, hey, I got this database and there are doctors getting paid to sterilize women, then there was no problem for the editor to say, go ahead, right? And so I'd say to people all the time, you can send a FOIA too early and you can pitch too early. That if you do some reporting up front to kind of substantiate your idea, and then you pitch it to the editor, you increase your possibilities of getting to a yes. I even say, if you can even report out your story to maybe 40 or 50 or 60% done, and then pitch it to your editor and say, hey, look, Bill, Jenny, whomever, I got this story that I'm working on, and this is what it says, and this is what interviews I've done, this is what data that I have, and we just need to do boop, boop, and boop, and I think it may take 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. That is a radically different conversation for an editor to hear than you coming in the beginning and say, you know what, I think the grass is green and I want to look into it, and they'll say, well, Corey, I don't think it's a story, right? Or Corey, I don't think we have enough time. Or Corey, you didn't do that other story, or you just focus on that other story first, and then maybe they will shoot that thing down, even if you're trying to prove that the grass is green, right? So that's my advice, and that's what happened. I had failed, honestly. I had failed so many times on this very same question until I figured out that if I had it in hand, or a lot of it in hand, then I get a yes easier. That by the time I got to the sterilization story, I already knew what to do. So I kept quiet for weeks and just reported on my own time until I had enough critical mass. And then, the rest was history.
That is really helpful. And it makes me think about a story that, Lakidra, I think I can show the other, let's see. Yes, Lakidra, this is a story, it's about the increased number of suicide among Black people in Chicago. And obviously this is a topic that is very sensitive. Again, depending on the editor, it might be a topic that might not get reported on or written enough about. There's a lot of stigma that comes with it. How did you get this story past your editors, and what was your process here?
Yeah, so suicide is such a difficult topic. I think not only to report, but even to just discuss that it's something that happens all across the country. When the pandemic first happened, at least in Chicago, so around mid-March, my editor had told me, keep an eye on suicide data in Chicago. And I realize now that I don't think he really meant that, but I did anyway. And so I would check the data, and this is from the Cook County Medical Examiner. The data is public. They have a data portal that you can use. And I would check it every single week while working on other stories. And then at first I wasn't noticing anything that stood out too much. And then around like late May, early June, I started noticing that the deaths for Black people in Cook were just really, really high compared to not only last year at the time, which was 2019, but it was higher than other years, going back like about 5 years, which seemed really odd to me. And so I called up some national researchers who focus on suicide, and I wanted to get their thoughts on the data the data trends that I was noticing, and also to just find out more about suicide in general and how it specifically might relate to Black people in America, and the history of how these trends are even documented, because not a lot of money goes to like hyper-specific communities around suicide, which is a lot unfortunate. But I talked to them, and they said, what you're seeing looks troubling, but you don't have 10-year data, so you can't really say anything with that much authority. And then around early July, I checked the data again and realized that it was just extremely high, and it was on the path to be, at that point, the worst since 2015, probably the worst in the decade, but I didn't have that, at the time. And so on a Saturday, I wrote up this pitch to my editors. Each Monday, we send them a note about what we're working on. Instead of that note, I sent them basically a very short, 600 story about this happening in Cook County. And at that time, it was only researchers, national researchers mostly, that I had spoken to. And my editors were, one, shocked that I had actually been keeping track of the data, but also felt that it was really important to do the story. And they gave me 4 days to report it out. And I reiterated to them what I had learned at that point from talking to so many researchers, which is that we needed 10-year data, and we needed to talk to people, families who had lost loved ones, to figure out maybe what was happening, that people were clearly having crises in a way that just was not happening in years prior. So I basically reported that story out in a week, and I started the week having talked to 6 experts, and then by the end of that week had talked to more than 30 people, including researchers, therapists, psychologists, and families as well, to get this final story. And through that FOIA that I filed with the medical examiner asking for a wider range of data, we were able to say with much more authority the extent of what was happening in Cook County.
And for that data that you got from the examiner's office, did you clean this on deadline?
Oh, yes, cleaned it on deadline, and the data was so messy. And I had known, I've worked with medical examiner data before over the years. And so I'd known already some of what the data could not tell me. So for example, the medical examiner does not do a good job of keeping track of Latino deaths in Cook County. The data going back, past 2015 is really, or I think 2014 is just really unreliable. So we went in knowing, some of the hiccups and challenges about what we were able to say about the extent of the problem for other communities. And then another thing, this isn't related to suicides, but for drug overdoses, the medical examiner didn't track things like fentanyl related deaths, which is a derivative of heroin, until like halfway through 2016. So it's good to talk to the agency about the data, what the limitations are. And I also talked to the lead medical examiner for this story on how they ensure that their data is accurate. So when there are problems, how soon is it updated? So I could get an understanding of how reliable the data was when it came through FOIA. But yeah, when we got it, it was really messy. But yeah, we were able to clean it up and make an analysis.
And this is something that I struggle with a lot in trying to explain to my editor. I often, and I don't know why I do this, I will go to my editor and say I got the data, but it's messy and I have to clean it. And instead of saying, there's a way to present this to your editor, right? Like you can do it, you can clean it, but I always lead with like, oh my God, it's a mess. I don't know what I'm going to do. How did you deal with that? And how did you present the problems and all the research that you had done already on what the data meant and what you can and couldn't say?
Yes. Yeah. So whenever I turn in a pitch, I also include what other reporting needs to be done. And so when I had mentioned that I needed more data, I could add in and say, look, I've talked to all of these experts that focus on suicidology around the country. They say we really need 10-year data to be able to, make such a huge assessment like this. And I just kept saying that to my editor like every single day, because they were ready to run the story with much less reporting than I did once the story was finished. So really reiterating, we need the 10-year data. I don't feel comfortable with the story running unless we have that 10-year data. And also we need to talk to families. So I made that clear from the get-go. And so when the data came in, it didn't matter that maybe it was a little messy because they already knew that this was one of the final steps in the process before the story would be published.
Sounds like you did a great job advocating for yourself and your story and the families. I mean, truly, like, and at the end of the day, like the families, right? When you have a story that is well reported and how all that information, the stories that you're telling people have much more context, right? And the impact is greater because you can actually see why it matters. And I want to switch topics a little bit here to Corey. There's a story that you reported in more recently with water, lead in the water in a county in Florida and a school in Florida. I thought it was really interesting because sometimes it's really difficult to pitch stories that other big news organizations had worked on. So oftentimes reporters might, an editor might say like, hey, they already did that in Detroit. Why would we do it here? Even though it obviously matters and everywhere in the country, right? How did you go about reporting this story? And how did you convince your editors that this was an important story in this community?
I went in with my editors and pointed out that in Flint, Michigan and other places, there was this growing trend around, lead being an issue. And I spent a lot of time reading and studying lead before I had that conversation. And I said to them, which was true then, if you live in a house that was built before 1978, then chances are that that house is going to have lead in the paint and lead in the pipes that collect the water from the city and go up through the faucets. And so I'd done some research and saw that Hillsborough County school system, which Hillsborough County is where Tampa is the county seat, which is the headquarters of the Tampa Bay Times. And so I did some research to find that the majority of the schools were built in the 1920s and 1930s. And the paper had done 0 stories on whether there was a lead problem in those schools. And so I presented it that way, and I laid out the studies and the likelihood of there being a problem. And my editor said, okay, go check it out. And I started to put forth records requests, looking at some of the oldest schools that were also in the areas where the schools had some of the worst academic achievement. as well as the highest amount of disciplinary actions. Because when you understand lead attacks the brains of children, and it particularly attacks IQ and the areas of the brain that deals with impulse control and violence. And so I had done that research to be able to target some really bad schools that likely could be having lead problems. And I sent a request over to the school district saying, tell me what you've done to test for lead, to test for the plumbing, and to know what's happening in this school. And some weeks came back and they said they could find no documents. And at first I was like, oh man, that's crazy. A week or two later, I got a tip that my request had actually caused them to secretly hire a firm to go test in those schools. And when they tested, they found lead all over the place. And so they decided, because this is what happens in America, unfortunately, when government finds out that there's a problem, they actually stop testing because they did not want to create a liability of knowing that all these schools had lead in them and they weren't going to do anything to fix them. And so when I got the tip, I went back and demanded that they give me the test results of what they had. And then that became the foundation of this story, that they knew that schools had lead, they quit testing, and they never told the parents and the teachers who were in those schools that those fountains they were using were spewing high levels
Wow.
of and that story then provoked a mad outcry and then forced the school district to test all of the schools and remove the bad fountains and a whole bunch of other really good reforms. But it all came from doing some, again, like a broken record, doing some good research before time so that I gave my editor a digestible pitch that made sense.
And I neglected to say earlier that if there are questions, if you can put them in the chat of the platform, we will get to them in a little bit here. But as we continue the conversation, so the documents that you got a response that I thought this was an interesting point. Basically, when you FOIA for any testing or any reports that had been written about lead, and you didn't get responsive records, I mean, that right there is a finding. I think maybe sometimes reporters might think like, oh, well, I didn't get anything, so there's no story there. How did you, how can we think about this in a different way? And obviously you did because you kept going, but tell us more about that thinking.
Well, so really the thinking that I had after they came back, I was suspicious. And my idea was actually to try to go to that school and sample some water out of the water fountains myself and then get them tested. I mean, that was a serious thought that we had. And me and my editor and the rest of the editing team went back and forth about trying to figure out how could we get in that school to get some, good data. And I ended up, as things happen, I ended up getting pulled into another story. And so that idea sat for a moment. And then once I finished the other story, we came back to it. And I got the tip that they had actually done some testing on their own anyway, and they just weren't revealing it. And so, but yeah, our next logical thought was not to drop the story, but to try to find our own way of testing that water because we thought it was that important.
And I'll stop sharing here for a next set of questions. So we actually do have one already. When you have a big data set, how do you make sure that you don't lose sight of what the story is, right? You can get lost in these massive databases. You can get lost in this massive amount of records. How do you keep your eye on the story?
That's a good question. I think different people come to that answer differently. For me, I'd see data as not a god in and of itself, but something that is to service the story. So for me, it was never oh my gosh, let's create a pretty data set. I mean, I want the data to be functional. I want it to service the larger good. And to my mind, the larger good was trying to establish one, our kids and staff exposed to a danger through these water fountains, through these sinks, and through the various ways. Because the sinks are important too, particularly in the cafeteria, in the kitchen, where water is used to clean off the vegetables and to do all that stuff, and leaded water can leach into food. And so we thought about, one, is there a problem that we can prove, quantify, and two, where exactly are these problems taking place? It's not enough just to say John Smith Elementary has lead. Where is it? On the first floor of a water fountain by the first grade teacher room? Where exactly is it, so that we can identify it and give that information to parents who need it the most, right? And so in this story, that's the approach we had. And I kept telling everyone in my team that somebody's mama needs this information. Somebody's, they need it so they can search it for your own, for that, so that they can take the steps to protect their children. And actually, when we got down to the showdown interviews with the school district, that's what we said to them. The school district was saying, well, you coming down hard on us. We tested, so that meant we cared about it. And I said, yeah, you tested, but you didn't give parents an opportunity to take steps to protect their own children. Even if you didn't have enough money to switch out those water fountains, you could at least tell them so they can bring bottled water to school and do other things to stay away from that danger, right? And so that's how I thought about the data. The data was really just trying to service a greater good, and that was to give people this information that they needed so that they could protect themselves and their most precious thing, which is their babies, right?
That's really helpful, right? Continue to think. I mean, these are people behind the data who are suffering, and that's the goal. Lakitra, this is something that I'll admit that I'm still struggling with as well. It's how to write the pitch to your editor. There is a way. One of my really good friends always told me that's my PR document of my story. I am pitching my own story to my editor, so I have to think of it that way as a marketing tool. How do you think of it? It sounds like you have a pretty good method of what goes into it, and how concise is it? How do you keep it?
Yeah, so I try to write out what my vision for the story is. And if I'm going to pitch something, I've usually already analyzed either data I've gotten publicly or through FOIA. So I already know a bit about, and I've done other research, talked to other folks. So I go in already knowing at minimum what the story will be. And then pitch it in a way that shows all of the potential if they can give me time to report on whatever it is that I want to look into. And then I also include what data, like I mentioned earlier, what data we need to be able to tell this story, and whether I've already gotten that data or whether I need to FOIA it. And then I also break down ways that I think the story can be told in, whether that's including like potential engagement or even things like, I think this is really just online, or maybe we can try a video or something like that. But yeah, I try to go in with the clear vision for the piece to show that I've done at least a little bit of reporting. And even before that, before I make the pitch, I will just mention what I'm looking into to my editor. I don't, editors are so busy, they juggle so much. So even if they're not paying attention completely, they know that this is something I've been keeping track of for several weeks or several months. So when the pitch does land in their, email, it's not surprising, and they know I've spent some time on it.
And we have a question from a grad student. He said, the person is saying, how do you balance an investigation and needing to do substantial amount of research while trying to keep confidentiality on the story from a competitive perspective? So I guess, how do you keep yourself from getting scooped?
Um, that's a really good question. Um, so sometimes being scoop is out of your control. When you're a reporter and you show up on anything, people get to talking. People get to talking that if you start filing records requests and having phone calls, there's going to be a buzz about what you're doing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That actually is a good thing. It creates momentum, which then gives people who work at an agency and who may have been done wrong or have seen stuff for years and never said something. It gives them life. It gives them motivation, and they come and try to seek you out so that they can, tell what they know. And so, but the flip side of that is people can also run and tell the other news organizations as well. And so one of the things that I try to do, even as I'm interviewing and talking to people and building a relationship, is to keep or to mention to them to just kind of keep this between us, or to warn them of the dangers of doing too much gossiping too soon. Um, uh, I tell people that I can't dictate what you do, but I can tell you that if we keep this confidentiality, it will help me to be most effective to getting at the truth. And then people make their own decisions about whether they want to keep it between you or then tell it to someone else. And you just have to kind of be okay with that. Here's the other thing about it is on these accountability stories and investigative stories, sometimes they're so big and they're so complicated that other people just can't, even if they told them, they just can't jump in and start working on it and beat you right away, because you might have a year head start or several months head start, and they're busy in their newsrooms. They're dealing with the same stuff that we're dealing with in terms of time pressures and all of that. And so the best thing I would say is not to stress so much about getting beat. Stress more about getting the story right. And if you get the story right, that takes care of everything else, honestly.
And just taking a step back, someone is asking in the chat, well, how did you even get to this point where you're researching an investigative story? What tips do you have to even get started?
I don't want to keep hogging the mic, Kedra.
Oh, tips to get started. I don't know. Whenever I'm interested in something, I always just try to find other stories that have been written in the past few years, and get an idea of what is being talked about publicly around a certain issue. I try to see if there's data available, to see if there's any analysis that I can do. And then I just start talking to people to see, what challenges there might be around a particular program or an agency or anything like that. But yeah, I have lots of story ideas. I have them all the time. And then as I slowly start to dig into it, sort of weeds out things that maybe aren't as important. So those are my suggestions. I look into a lot of stuff, and I'll look and see if there's historical context, if there are any annual reports, just gathering as much information as possible. And eventually there might be an investigative story there.
I had a editor, and this is true, who used to tell me every story that you've ever written has already been written, but the problem continues. So you just have to figure out where we are now in history. And that kind of helps. And Corey, sometimes after you're done with a big investigative project, you've given it everything and you're so excited, and then it publishes, and then the next later you come back to your newsroom and you have to pitch something else. And again, you're freaking out because I don't know, maybe I can do it. Maybe this was my one story that I found and I'm never going to be able to find anything again. How did you get going again? It sounds like you have multiple things going always in the background, but just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So if I can be blunt and not so politically correct to just say, America is a fucked up place. Yes, there are people who are suffering and getting hurt all day long, and those stories are rarely getting told. Journalism, for as good as it is and as much as it needs to be celebrated, often misses the majority of the harm that's happening on a daily basis. And so what Lakedra said, I wholeheartedly endorse. You got to keep your curiosity. Your curiosity is your power as a journalist. And as a Black man, I live in this world. So everything that happens to everybody else happens to me. I hadn't been shot, thank God, but I know I've had police pull me over unjustly and everything else. And so it's not hard for me to find investigative opportunities. They're all over the place, right? And so what I would say to people is keep yourself open and keep looking around and keep listening, and you'll never want for ideas and story opportunities as long as you're doing that. And believe it or not, that's easier said than done, because sometimes we can be so caught up in the work that we and living that we get walled off from what's happening around us at times. We just don't have time to be curious. We have time just to do what we have to do and then go home and do it again. But if we can somehow push past that and keep ask the universe to keep feeding us, the hurt and the suffering that's around us that we may not be aware of, then you'll never really have any problem finding stories to do.
From the chat again, Lakedra, how many stories do you often work on at the same time? How many are you juggling?
I think right now maybe 5. I think. Yeah, I think 5 stories. And I'm always in contact with my editor about what I'm focusing on. So I sort of split it into, here's what I'm working on in the short term, and here are some longer term projects that I've already talked to you about and that I'm working on. So yeah, I tend to work on a lot of different stories at once, because you just never know which story is going to move faster. And when that story gets close to, getting ready, then of course you turn most of your attention or all of your attention to that piece. But I do tend to juggle a lot. At the beginning of the year, I sat down with my editors and just told them what I felt needed to be prioritized with some of these projects. So we were all on the same page about what stories might take a lot of time and what can sort of, be a shorter turnaround thing. So yeah, it's a lot.
Corey, and I know we have we actually have like 9 minutes left, but I kind of want to ask you a little bit about, being a person of color in the newsroom. And one of the things that sometimes is difficult to take in is this idea that we are reporting to expose wrongdoing, but in our newsroom, sometimes the wrongdoing is being done to us. And there could be a discrepancy between both. And sometimes the feeling is like, oh my gosh, how am I going to tell this story when I can't even advocate for myself here? How do you deal with that sort of double standard, the discrepancy of what we're trying to do on our mission, and how difficult is it to work in newsrooms that are not fully integrated, for lack of a better way to describe it?
That's a really good and thorny question, because it's sensitive. I've been in newsrooms where they absolutely were not progressive, and I felt invisible. I felt undervalued, and oftentimes I was on a project, and so I was having to fight for the story and the government and the time pressures, and I also was having to fight the newsroom to make sure the story landed right and all. And frankly, it can burn you out. and frankly, a lot of journalists of color have left the business because of these struggles. Um, what I have come to learn that can help uh, is that you want to go into a newsroom uh, with the idea that you're going to need advocates. You're going to need to make relationships at every level. You need friends or advocates or people who believe in you as a human being and as a colleague in the at the reporter stage, and at least one editor or two who also believe in you, because those people can be in, they're going to be in the rooms where you're not, and when the gossip comes up or opportunities come up, you want someone in there who can give the other view. They can say, "Oh no, actually Corey's a good guy," or Lakedra is a good, she works hard, because it's going to happen. We just live in in a country that doesn't hasn't taught all people how to truly see us as worthy human beings, just like everyone else. And so you want somebody to say, no, they're not messing around. They actually were out on assignment. No, they put in extra hours. No, they're you need that. And so you have to cultivate. I know a lot of us, I know a lot of journalists who are actually introverts, really hardcore introverts, and they don't like a lot of people in their business. They don't like to reach out and go to people's house or go drink or do all that other stuff. And what I have come to learn is that that kind of socializing is necessary to keep you sane and protected in newsrooms. That if you don't dedicate some time to spending some time, you don't have to drink or smoke or do all the other stuff that journalists sometimes do, but you do have to be social outside of the newsroom, because a lot of decisions that get made in the newsroom actually got made outside the newsroom with the relationships that people had. And the coming into the newsroom was just a formality. So anyway, not to go on and on and on, I would say network within the building, build a relationship. Everybody ain't gonna like you, but if you can at least have you one, two, or three advocates, not just the interns, but somebody with some real power, that can be your saving grace and help you progress and not degress and not be frustrated. Because I can tell you, not having advocates, I don't care how good you are, how ethical you are, people will interpret it in a different way, and they will frustrate you to no end, and that's just not a good place to be.
And that, yeah, that is real. I mean, we see it, right? Journalists of color tend to leave the industry when they get to mid-career, and we have a real problem that we need to try to address it. And that's part of what we try to do with FOIA Fest, right? It's continue to invest in yourself, continue. There are other people out there, even if they're not in your newsroom. Sometimes there's just not one in the newsroom, especially when you work in a small newsroom, that might be able to help you, but someone else outside of the newsroom might understand what you're going through. And we just have a couple minutes left. Lakedra, I know that this is a big question and a big topic, but you also sit at the intersection of being a woman, being a young woman, and being a Black woman. Any thoughts on how you are able to keep yourself from sinking when in difficult days?
Yeah, I think it's hard because when you are, a younger reporter, especially if you're a Black reporter, especially if you're a woman, anytime you speak out and advocate for yourself, someone is going to likely interpret that as you demanding too much or being too aggressive. Like Corey said, sometimes it doesn't even matter about the work. It's just these internal biases that people have that clearly come out in the newsroom. But I think when you might feel diminished by certain decisions your newsroom is making, or feel like the stories that you want to tell aren't getting told, just power through, find those advocates in the newsroom and keep reporting out those stories. don't get sidetracked by the isolation. I think one of the things that 2020 made so clear publicly is that this is a widespread and pervasive problems in newsrooms. So you are not alone. And yeah, just keep reporting out those stories and those investigations, because eventually someone is going to notice. So that's my advice, and keep advocating for yourself. I feel like I've been in the industry long enough now that when I do notice, maybe someone's not really paying attention to what I'm saying. They're just sort of, for example, critiquing the tone or something like that. Then I tend to just like be very direct about that, and to have those conversations. So keep advocating for yourself.
That's a great end note. I just want to thank you both for being here. Thank you, India, for helping us with all the questions. I had a great time. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thank